Hello, welcome to this episode of the More Than This podcast. I'm your host, Cindy Brannon, author, teacher, applied social psychologist, witch, many other things. Today, I'm going to be exploring my relationship with the High Priestess, where I find myself in connection with this archetype, how connecting to the archetype of the High Priestess can be beautiful, it can be empowering, it can help us develop our own identity, our own wholeness, and that desiring to be a High Priestess is a transformative journey. You know, the journey of the High Priestess is one of empowering, it's one of exploring the magic, medicine, and mysteries of Hekate and her deeper world. There is so much there for us to discover in the territory of the High Priestess. She truly teaches us that we are so much more than the mundane, that we are so much more than belonging to an ideology where God is male and on high, and that women and the feminine are fundamentally flawed and always to be seen as the lesser compared to the superior maleness. There's so much that the High Priestess can teach us. So let's explore these mysteries she offers together in this episode. Let's do our opening podcast ritual. If you have a candle available to you, I invite you now to grab it and we'll light it together and do a bit of a meditation and ritual, just welcoming in the spirit of the High Priestess and truly understanding the High Priestess as a spirit, as a force that is archetypal and that gets expressed in many different ways through individuals, through art, literature, religion, that she is a force that exists. She is primordial. She is connected to the sacred and the divine. And we are in relation to her when we become the High Priestess of our own lives, and perhaps even become a priestess in a community or a different system, maybe even in a religion, if that's your thing. Religion is not my thing. I've talked about that before. Okay, let's begin. If you've got your candle, if not, just relax into my candle, and we're going to begin by moving the candle with the left hand in a counterclockwise direction and starting to just feel the cleansing energy, envisioning what's blocking and binding you, starting to loosen and untangle. Taking a breath here and really on the exhale, just letting it all go. Bringing the candle back to heart center if you're doing it along with me. And we're going to switch it to right hand. And we're going to go in a clockwise direction. And we're going to bring in just a protective, nourishing, sacred circle, temenos, around us, and awaken that within us to see ourselves as sacred. For that is truly what the High Priestess has to teach us, that we are the ones who preside in very sacred ways over our own lives. And now I offer you the blessing, the invocation. If you want to soften into the candle, close your eyes, just open up as I read our invocation. It's a little poem that I wrote. You are Temenos, the sacred. Your mind is the altar, and your soul is the shrine upon it. Your breath is the magic, and your life is the ritual. Do not yield to those who attempt to violate your temple. Do not engage with those who attempt to trick your mind. Do not open your soul to those who would steal it. As long as we tend to our own temple, all is sacred, all is well. You are your own high priestess. And just stay with that for a moment. Any images, sensations, songs, anything that comes to mind, take note here for later. Pause if you need to so you can make some notes. And let's start to explore the High Priestess together. Okay, so I love keywords, and if you're a student in my school, the Covina Institute, you know I always do keywords and have indexes. So our keywords for this podcast, if you want to scribble them down, I know a lot of you are note takers like me. We are talking about desire, identity, personal empowerment, and temenos, the idea that our lives are sacred. And this comes from Jungian psychology. The idea of temenos is the sacred interior landscape of the soul and the deeper self. So let's dive in. Those are our keywords. Desire, which is the spirit of Eros. In some of the myths, the Orphic myths in particular, he is seen as being born of Nyx, the night goddess, the dark goddess, that she birthed desire into the world. And certainly the high priestess carries the energy of desire, and she awakens Eros within us in many ways. Identity is all about the quest to be who we are at our core. You know, we live in 2021 and we find so many beautiful explorations of identity in terms of gender and sexuality and expressions. We see, movements to stop this horrible body shaming. We see so many amazing explorations of identity on the socials and so on, and exploring the high priestess, how she might relate to us and how that might be part of our identity, is an absolutely beautiful journey. So, and for me personally, exploring the high priestess, being in deep dialogue with her, really mining what she means to me, that has been my primary quest for this past year of 2021. I'm going to do this episode in two parts. The first part, I'm going to be talking about being your own high priestess and some of the history, particularly how it relates to the goddess Hekate and her followers in the ancient world. And in the second part, I'll be doing the Hecate's help desk for this episode, which I'm answering. I get this question several times a week in emails and messages. I want to be a high priestess of Hekate. How do I do it? How do I study with you to become a priestess of Hekate? So the first part is going to be all about what being a high priestess really means personally and looking at the history. Second part, formal training to be a high priestess. Your homework for this episode, I'm a teacher. That's the archetype for me that I embody, I think, is equally to mother and witch. Homework is the High Priestess Oracle Reading. It's going to be up on my Searchie, Searchie Hub, which you can find on all of my socials, linked in my profile. So I will have that there with a graphic so you can do the High Priestess Oracle Reading yourself. And let's begin. So for me, when I begin an exploration of what a word means to me personally, I like to look at the etymology of the word, the origins of the word, how the word has been understood throughout history, maybe how other cultures view the word. I love to do these deep dives. I love my Oxford English dictionary and really diving in. So I've been planning to do an episode on the High Priestess. I wanted to begin by talking about the witch. And then I wanted to transition to talking about the goddess. And now we're on the high priestess. This is kind of like the bookend. You see the goddess in the middle, the archetype of the witch on one side, the archetype of the priestess, high priestess on the other side. So I wanted to explore them as their own triumvirate, their own triple goddess in and of themselves, to show how they are different yet the same, how in terms of the history and literature and art relating to the goddess Hekate, how that all has been demonstrated throughout history, and how we might experience it personally and what it might mean to us. So I like to start at the beginning. So the first thing I have to say a word about the word priestess is that in the ancient Mediterranean, those who were involved as religious leaders who were women would not have been called priestess. Priestess is a derivative of the word priest and comes from Latin. So to the Greeks and the Egyptians and the earlier areas that might have venerated Hekate, different words would have been used most likely. For example, the Sibyls, who were the prophetess priestesses in some temples. You may have heard of the Cumaean Sibyl, for example. The Pythia were very similar. And so they had a role in ancient religion where they did oracles. They played important roles in the community, educational roles even. They were not the high priestess, how we might think of it as being like the temple boss. So even in the ancient world, this difference between how men were in public leadership positions and women, for the most part, weren't, becomes something we really need to set on the table and examine when we examine the history of the high priestess within religion. And it really applies to our own life as well, because a lot of times the archetype of the high priestess, whether she keeps coming up to us in our tarot readings or other ways, when she's pressing on us and saying, hey, pay attention to me, I've got some important things to teach you, we need to consider how she has been portrayed. If we see her as this spirit that exists, a lunar spirit, a spirit of intuition, of the mysteries, of the oracles, perhaps of magic, of herbalism, of helping others, being of service to the community, but she was always outside of the power structure, even when she was like a Sibyl or a Pythia, part of the religious structure. She was, the Pythia on her tripod was not necessarily the temple boss. She had a very specific role to play. She was not the Hierophant, to keep with a tarot metaphor. So who was she? This ancient woman who had an important role to play in the ancient Mediterranean and perhaps even in ancient temples of Hekate. Who was she? Oftentimes, like I mentioned before, she was involved as an oracle, that people would come to her with their queries, and she would do different things involving looking at omens, augury with birds, for example, looking at the bay leaves, using sacred smoke, imbibing things that may have been hallucinogenics and so on to get her into this transcendent state to divine the oracles. That was something that was part of the structure. Also part of ancient temple structures were what we might call priestesses today in the 21st century. They played roles in terms of civic engagement, helping others learn and performing rituals and so on. And I just want to reiterate that the word priestess comes from the word priest. So we have this idea that the priest, the male, is the normative, and that the female is the derivative of the male. And for me, right from the get-go, when I start to think about the high priestess, and it can be so beautiful and empowering and help us with our own identity, and at the same time, I feel this kind of pinchiness where it's like, okay, priestess comes from priest. It means woman is derived from man. And we're back at the Adam and Eve story. Now, this isn't to say, of course, that we can't find great power from becoming high priestess of our own lives, and that there's so many beautiful modern books about how to become your own high priestess. We have a lot of reclaiming to do. I just wanted to kind of plant that idea out there that the title priestess, like goddess, is a derivative of the masculine. So for me, part of my journey to my own identity and my own empowerment has been to find words that aren't derivatives of the masculine, but are purely feminine in origin, in etymology, and that feel really right to me. And perhaps this is part of why I identify so strongly with the archetype of the witch, because although, of course, other genders have always been witches and so on, overarchingly, in my experience and in my research, that this is about the feminine, just like the goddess is about the feminine. The high priestess is also about the feminine, and untangling that from the idea that what is masculine is normative and what is feminine is disruptive, wild, chaotic, undesirable, getting away from all of those societal mores about the feminine. It's been a huge part of my own individuation journey, which is the idea from depth psychology that as we come into our personal wholeness, we become a full individual unto ourselves. So we're not like possessed by any one archetype. You know, identifying as a witch is one aspect of who I am. It's not everything. And like I said earlier, I identified 2021 as my year to really go in deep with the high priestess to see where I landed at the end of the year. So I'm recording this near the end of 2021. And in my school, I even declared this the year of the high priestess, Propylaea, the year before the gate. You know, the gatekeeper was often a feminine role in temples. And also within, Hecate's history, in addition to the Sibyls and the Pythia, there were those who were priestesses in the modern sense in temples, specifically at the temple in Lagina, modern day Turkey, that were called key bearers or keepers of the keys. And indeed, it was these kleidokoi or kleidokus, singular, that inspired me to call the blog Keeping Her Keys and then write the book Keeping Her Keys. So the kleidokos as a type of priestess would have been one who kept the temple keys, literally, like in a literal sense. So she would have been associated with the threshold, crossing from the outside world into the sacred space. And you can see why this title was also applied to Hekate as the one who was keeping the keys, leading you into the deeper world, the mysteries of Hekate, her magic, and so on. So this was an ancient title in religion, used in temples to Hekate, but also used in other temples. And it also did apply to men as well. But specifically, this title for women had a very potent meaning. So when a woman was married, the husband would give her the keys to the household, that she was presiding over, the home temple. And so it had this gendered meaning that although, the masculine, the man, the husband, perhaps was the owner of the house, the temple, that the wife, the woman, the priestess had the power of opening and closing it and who got into it and so on. She could lock her husband out because she had the keys. So there's all this history around what Cleidochus means, and that it was also applied to Hekate. It speaks of a special relationship to the sacred feminine and also the practical feminine, that women were associated with this same role given to her that was about thresholds, crossroads, being able to get in and out of the house, presiding over the house, and that kind of liminal zone. And in the temple at Lagina, there's a lot of historical records existing as they continue to excavate this temple. They find more things, of course, that there was a procession, there was at least an annual celebration where a kore, Kore, a young adolescent girl, would be given a key, and she would play the role in a ceremonial way of key bearer, and that the key would go between the temple at Lagina to the city, and that this procession represented, the unification of the civic or the civilized, the city, the structure, with the religious or the spiritual. So there is that kind of wholeness coming together. And when we're exploring the High Priestess today, because women's roles in organized religions have been so denigrated, really up until recent decades, that we have a lot of reclaiming work to do in seeing women as spiritual leaders, spiritual teachers, and, as high priestesses. By that, I'm referring to, like, in the community sense, serving in a religious capacity. And also for us as women, becoming the high priestess of our own lives, trusting our own tuition, developing a religion of our own, something that works really beautifully for us, maybe not anybody else, but it's what rings true and right for us. So there's so much for us to kind of overcome. And it's interesting, even in Christianity, Jesus in many ways saw women as spiritual teachers and leaders. And if we look at the early history of the Christian church, like kind of before it became Christianity, and things like of the Book of Mary, we can see women as what we might call high priestesses of those early days before Christianity became dogmatized and really became weaponized as a way, something against women, that, men were all powerful, men occupied the public sphere, which would have included churches, and that women were relegated to the home. And so there's a lot for us to learn from the High Priestess. And it really is like an unlearning, saying that as women, like intuition, what is lunar, what is interior, what is beautiful, what is magical, what is mysterious, all these things that are like non-rational, non-linear, not something we can measure and put on a table. When you think of the idea of sin, for example, it's like, well, if you do this thing wrong, then you go to hell. The High Priestess, to me, as an archetype, is the opposite of that. It's about acceptance and expressing your own uniqueness rather than conforming through a bunch of rules. I think the High Priestess will always be somewhat of a rebel and somewhat of an outsider, even within organized religion, because as an archetype, she is inherently not the one who wants to tell you how to live your life. She wants to guide you to your own healing and wholeness. She's not didactic. She's supportive. She's not about power over. She's about power with. And that's a lot for us in our society to kind of undo all of this. That we've been told that we're not sacred, that we're defective, that God is the right and the goddess is the derivative. There's so much around all of this for us to unpack. And the high priestess, I believe, like, she stands at the gate to her temple, to her mysteries underneath the moon, saying, you know, come in here and see what you find for yourself. See how you can awaken your intuition. See how you are strong and wild and free and a goddess loving warrior, rather than, you know, a foot soldier in God's army marching off to war, doing exactly what the power structure says. There's this difference. And it is my sincere hope that as women become spiritual leaders, and indeed in organized religion, you see this, like my recent encounter with a woman who identified as an Anglican priest, that we retain some of these archetypally feminine signatures of anima, sorry, and that we allow what is the intuitive, mysterious feeling rather than knowing, that we allow all of this to remain, and we don't take the high priestess and make her basically a female version of the archetypal hierophant or priest. That's not at all what I desire. I desire to have a world where there is both, and there is equal company for what is archetypally masculine and archetypally feminine, when it of course gets expressed in many different ways when it gets down to the level of individuality in our own identity and how we do gender or don't do gender. So there's so much to kind of dive into in terms of this. I wanted to talk a little bit about historical priestesses of Hekate. And there's two main sources for this. Well, really three main sources. So there's historical records. I already mentioned, like the temple at Lagina and other documents that have been analyzed and theorized about by modern scholars. Then there are also works of art and literature. So depictions. You may have seen some of John Waterhouse's beautiful paintings that are so evocative of the high priestess. So we have a lot of art to look at, to explore what the high priestess might mean to us and what she's meant throughout history. And then we also have fictional accounts. So when I was kind of shuffling through all of this and looking at what I wanted to focus on, because there's just too much to focus on, I decided to kind of zone in on one particular story that's meant a lot to me over the years. So this is the story of Samatha. It comes from the second idyll of Theocritus, and it's a poem about a woman scorned, and she's had her heart broken by Delphus, who is just a no good guy who's trampled with her affections, kind of abandoned her, and she is righteously pissed off about him ghosting her. And this particular story, so Theocritus's idols are seen as poems that reflect reality. They're not a fantasy. So we're not talking about the Lord of the Rings in his poems. We're talking about something like Alice Hoffman's practical magic books, where the reality is the reality of the times in which he was living and writing about, with elements of magic. It's not pure fantasy. So in this story, Samatha evokes Hekate, Circe, Medea, and even, as she calls her, blonde Paramede. She also evokes Selene to help her get her sweet revenge against Delphus for ghosting her. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it. But now I will bind him with offerings, moon, which she would have called Selene. Selene, shine clearly. I will sing softly to you, goddess and earthly Hekate, she whom dogs tremble at as she goes among the tombs of the dead and the black blood. Hail, frightful Hekate, and attend me to the end, making these drugs stronger than those of Circe or Medea or blonde Paramede. And I'm referring to a great book by Joan Burton. It's called Theocritus's Urban Mimes, Mobility, Gender, and Patronage. I use that in addition to several other academic writings about the Samatha story to kind of summarize what might have been the context for this story, how the ancients might have understood it, and what Theocritus probably meant in writing it. So we have to talk about Delphus, because Delphus was, a man of the times, very much, a man in the mainstream. He was athletic, he was learned, he was accomplished. I kind of envision Delphus 2021 version. He is the guy in the suit with a profession, making lots of money. He's got an Ivy League education. He plays sports, definitely downhill skis, and drives, a posh car, has a fancy condo. Delphus kind of has it all going on. Samatha, on the other hand, there's not a lot that Theocritus really talks about in terms of who she is. A lot of attention in his poem is given to, let's be clear about Delphus's identity. Samatha, there's a lot of kind of breadcrumbs dropped. And the Samatha story has really enchanted a lot of classical scholars, and there's a lot written about Samatha. And something that's struck me in studying these different writings about her from a scholarly perspective is how different authors give her different titles. So in one recent paper, she's actually called a courtesan. And in other papers, she's called a witch or a sorceress. And then sometimes she is actually called a priestess. And I think Samatha's story is a great place for us to explore both the history and how we can become the high priestess of our own life. So was she a priestess? This has nothing to do with religion. So for me, that, using that kind of classical OED definition of priestess as a woman who presides over a religion in some capacity, no, Samatha in no way is that kind of priestess. She is a woman, what we know from the story, that she's a woman who lives on her own, doesn't have a husband or children, that she has at least one slave girl, because in the poem, she gets this slave girl to help her out. So we already know that Samatha is different than the mainstream of women in the time that Theocritus was writing this poem. She wasn't married. A woman had to be married to have legitimate status in society. There's no mention of that if she's living in her father's house. It seems like she's a woman living on her own. So newer scholarship, like Christopher Ferrone's paper from 2020, calls her a courtesan. That his theory, at least, is that Samatha had found a means to kind of support herself and run her own household. So what Theocritus might have meant by this story is that a woman who is on her own and independent, any decent Greek man is going to reject her and ghost her because that's not the norm. That's not what's right. That's not a desirable woman, right from the get-go. Because she is very much being the priestess of her own destiny, of her own household, and so on. And Samatha's use of magic is really important in this story because, again, if we go with this idea that Theocritus was exploring the difference between the civilized in terms of Delphus and the wild, intuitive in terms of Samatha, if you look at that, and so the use of magic by this time that it was written, which again is later, this is not, this is after, let's say, the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It's after the Theogony, Hesiod's Theogony, writing about Hekate as the great mother goddess. So it's after that. We're approaching the time of Jesus and the rise of Christianity, just to give you a bit of a timeline. So women's roles within the society were really in flux. This would have been like the time of the Sibyls and the Pythia, but also kind of like in the beginning of the decline of them in the ancient Mediterranean, as this kind of dichotomy where only men held any kind of precedence in the public sphere, with some very notable yet rare exceptions. So there's this whole thing that magic is something that belongs to women. This idea is starting to take shape, and you can see it even now in terms of the archetype of the witch, and throughout lore and history, that there's a certain type of magic that is wild, intuitive, based in herbs and the use of what we call today correspondences, that belongs to women, and what we might see as like ceremonial or religious ritual and magic, that belongs to the church and men, and that there is this divide between a natural kind of magic, which is for women, and a ceremonial kind of magic, which is for the church and men, and so on. So there's that idea at play here. Although in this story, Delphus certainly isn't practicing magic. He's busy being a good, upright man, driving his fancy sedan and going to his office downtown and doing all of those kind of things in a modern sense. So Samatha in this story takes these things that make Delphus respectable and kind of turns them against him in her binding spell. And she really finds a way to empower herself through this magic, that she's binding him. Let's just have a little bit of an excerpt here. May Delphus's flesh be destroyed in the flame, because I am on fire for him. So she's giving back to him what he has created in her. May he waste with love for me, the way she is, of course, and the way she felt her beauty had been wasted on him. So she's using all of these aspects against him that he has inflicted upon her by, convincing her that he cared about her and, her opening herself up to the relationship whereby she wouldn't have been able to become a respectable woman. Like he really stole something from her. She had every right to be raging the way she is. And as a woman, being able to turn to natural magic was what was available to her. And, in this way, Theocritus may have been reflecting what women were actually doing. And we see parallels to this story, of course, in Circe and Medea, in those myths about the two of them, because women's power in the public world was so limited back then that magic was a way for them to turn the tables and claim their power. So if you want to know the instructions about this spell, it was a type of incantation bowl. Samatha orders her slave to line a bowl with crimson wool. And then there's an image that's created within it. And then she adds herbs and an incantation, much in the sense of those beautiful incantation bowls that you can find, and as was discussed in Sumant Kidd's book, The Book of Longings. So she uses different things that represented power, civilization, masculinity in this spell. She uses like red. Delphus was wearing crimson bands at the symposia. So she uses all of these elements to cast this spell. And the goal of her spell is to separate Delphus from his very successful, structured, civilized, socially acceptable life, and to make him mad, to pull him into her world on the fringes. And in that act, because she is performing magic, she is connecting, to the sacred feminine, to the goddess, and being very subversive. And she's also really keenly aware of her place in society, that this is what's available to her, and that Delphus has denied her of being able to come into the mainstream. But is she a high priestess? And are the academics who refer to her as a priestess, are they correct? Not in the sense of the definition that she has to be part of an organized religion and leading a community, but in the sense of being her own priestess, and a priestess of Hekate and Medea and Circe, who I wrote so much about in my book, Entering Hecate's Garden. Yes, she is that kind of priestess. She is their priestess because they govern the natural world, magic, the feminine, and also upsetting the status quo. They govern that. So yes, she is their priestess, and she is her own high priestess. And yet she is also really subjugated to the norms of society. So there's so much for us to dive into by exploring this story of Samatha, the wronged woman, and, in the play about Medea, and certainly in Madeline Miller's great novel, Circe, there's a lot for us to see how they became priestesses of Hekate in terms of allowing her energy to be expressed into the world, and how they allowed themselves to become high priestesses of their own lives. For me, in doing this deep dive into what the high priestess means to me and why I decided to call this episode what I did, is that I get a lot of messages, emails, and so on addressing me as a high priestess. And I've even used the title myself over the years. I've been at this for a long time. It's been decades since I led, my first Pagans in the Park kind of ritual. And So I've had a lot of time to be in company with the idea of being a high priestess. And I'll say that I used to want to have that kind of status. But as I got deeper into my own journey and who I am in this and what my mission is in this life, I don't believe the high priestess is like the right title for me. I'm teacher, which psychologist, a lot of things. And sometimes I will play the role of the high priestess and allow her to speak through me when I'm teaching rituals, but I fundamentally don't accept the idea that my work constitutes a structured religion at all. I am an advocate 100% for creating your own religion. Perhaps you are inspired by my teaching and writing, and you use that to weave your own. But I never want anyone to think I'm the high priestess, the temple boss here, and my school is a religion. And if you do what I say to do, all will be well. You will be blessed by me. Because I really feel that in our world today, where we are at, kind of 100 years into, like, I don't know, Blavatsky and others reclaiming the goddess and moving her into the culture in ways that she hadn't been for centuries and centuries, and trying to find our way back to women as spiritual leaders, find our way back to reinterpreting the stories from the ancient world and modern stories about the goddess, the great mother, and so on. Like, as we're doing all of this, for me, what I really want to say is that do this for yourself. The way to become a high priestess of an organization is to first embark on the journey of becoming the high priestess of your own life. That if our lives are not lived as temenos, as sacred space, our bodies, minds, soul, that if we have a messy, chaotic life, really led more by the shadow than by the soul, then I don't believe that we're in any position to be presiding over a religious community. And like I said, for me, I'm not criticizing anybody else. I'm talking about me. This is an archetype I've thought about for 2 decades now. I've been in company with her. I don't run a religion, I run a school. I'm not your high priestess. I'm your teacher, your guide. There is a title that I am quite comfortable with in terms of formal ritual settings, which would be that of Kleidokus, being the key bearer, the keeper of the keys of the temple. In examining the ancient records about women as Kleidokai, I found that to be a role that really is meaningful for me. To be a key bearer involved, it was a civic responsibility. You were a community leader. It implied that you were of service to others and that you presided over thresholds and had the power to be a gatekeeper, to let the right ones in and keep the wrong ones out of Temenos, the most sacred places in the temple. So that, for me, as a keeper of keys of my own lives, and also as a keeper of keys for my school and my writing and so on, this whole imagery around holding the keys and sharing them at will with others is one that feels right for me. So if you're in my school, you'll notice that my official role is executive director, because we have to be practical, and keeper of keys, because that for me feels right. If high priestess is what feels right for you in terms of community involvement, that's beautiful and wonderful. I'm not criticizing anybody. You do you. I'm talking about my own journey as a means of perhaps inspiring you to figure out where you land with the idea of the high priestess. So I thought I would just read a little bit from an academic article on key bearers in ancient Greece. Iphigenia was the key holder and gatekeeper of the temple of Artemis at Broron. Io was the key holder of Hera at Argos. Hecuba, who was the queen of Troy, says to Cassandra, who is the key holder of Apollo, that she should lose her sacred keys. Pythia, the priestess of Apollo at Delphi, is not described in literary sources as a key holder, but represented in a vase painting as a Cleidochus. So we see these different priestesses, what we would call modern terms priestesses, these figures, the Pythia, Cassandra, and so on, being assigned the mythic role of key holder. And there's also historical figures, such as Aphia, who was a priestess of Hekate at Legina, who I consider a spiritual ancestor of mine. And I love engaging with her presence. So we see that both in terms of like fictional or mythic accounts and in practical records, that being a Cleidochus was a role that was available to women. And like I said, for me, that is where I land in terms of my identity as a woman who is a spiritual teacher. I hope that this exploration of the High Priestess and the story of Samatha will perhaps lead you to see how you are so much more than someone who has been conditioned to see the sacred feminine, the High Priestess, as less than or as suspicious, to see her really as something beautiful and as a very important teacher that can help you regardless of your gender or what you believe in or what religion you belong to or not, that she can help you to be more intuitive, to be more connected to who you are in the center of your being, and ultimately can really help you to awaken to your own desire of what is true and right for you in this life. I'm going to move on to part 2 of this episode of the podcast, where I answer the question of how do I become a trained priestess of Hekate.